Hello, Hidden Gems.
Hello,
Hap
everyone.
Happy Hidden Hour. We're so glad to be here tonight, and boy, do we have a lot to talk about. Those that were with me watching the trial of Robert Tellis, the murder trial of Robert Tellis, you'll know what I'm talking about when we have a lot to talk about because we all watched the accused murderer testify on stand, and it was fascinating. And I'm not the only one that thinks that. The psychologist in the room with us right now also thinks it was fascinating. Um, he said as much to me privately on the phone between breaks, going, "What?" Yeah, shaking his head,
Yeah,
texting me during court, saying, "This is wild." So if you want to know what someone thinks from a journalist that was actually there in court and a criminal psychologist watching it live, you're in the right place.
it
We
was
Go ahead.
it was totally bonkers. So, I mean, I've been a forensic psychologist now for almost 30 years. I've never seen anything like this. This moment, and this happened in our backyard. You were there. It seems like every time you attend a trial, something crazy happens. So I don't know. We got to keep going to these trials, but first of all, it's extremely rare that a defendant will testify in a narrative format, and that's going to occur usually, by the way, when the defense team, when the offense attorneys are just throwing up their hands and like, I don't, whatever. You this guy Talis or Teus, we'll talk about that. Apparently he wants to
We'll talk about that.
we'll talk about that, but he was initially pro se, so he was representing himself, and then I think the judge, I don't know if she forced it, but I think she was pretty persuasive in terms of him getting defense attorneys. He went through a number of defense attorneys, by the way. So I think these attorneys pretty much they were at the end of their rope, and he was persistent about wanting to testify, and they're just like, look, we're not going to have anything to do with perjury here. So just go up there and do your act, or put on your show, and we'll just sit back and watch. So but I mean, the fact that you had a defendant in such a high profile case take the stand in essentially a narrative format is highly unusual. Usually the defense is directing people like this so that they don't step on landmines. Not so in this case. So there were a lot of landmines to step on, and he found a lot of them. He did step on them. So, I mean, I think every true crime fan should watch this because it's so instructive of what goes on in the mind of a murderer, and it's incredible to watch this kind of testimony because you really get to see in kind of an unvarnished fashion. I guess I still have to say alleged murderer, but you get to see in unvarnished fashion an alleged murderer talking openly in a narrative format about their perception of a crime. And so that's rare. I think you and I have talked about, we're going to do a deeper dive at some point where we can kind of go through step by step his testimony and break it down. Tonight we'll talk in broad strokes about what happened, but this is unusual. And for any true crime fan, I think watching this is worthwhile because it's really a snapshot into the psyche of a alleged murderer.
Yeah, and we say true crime community. The irony is John and I literally had a conversation about how we don't like to say true crime fan. You said it a couple times. That's so funny. I think you're saying that because we literally talked about how we don't like it when people say that, and then you said it twice. But we don't mean that.
Yeah, right. I mean, I'm a true crime fan, so
a fan of watching trials. Right. We know what that means.
Right. True crime community. Yeah, and I don't mean a fan of ours. I mean just somebody who likes true crime, not
fascinated with true crime.
Right. Yeah, just somebody that, whether they watch our channel or not, it's irrelevant. Just somebody who, yeah. somebody who's fascinated by the criminal mind, and they don't need us to see this guy testify. They don't need our interpretation. I mean, I appreciate it when people tune into our channel to get a perspective on this, but hopefully from someone who's done it for a while.
None of us are a fan of when people commit crime. That's what I'm referring to.
Yeah, no.
That's what I'm referring to. Yeah. And we know that. But yeah, those that are intrigued by the process and the court process. Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, this was wild. This is wild. And I've never seen someone, as you point out, narrate. Well, you said, by the way, in your excellent analysis, which I want to get to, because I feel like everything you said was exactly right before trial started. Everything you said in your testimony, in my opinion, you nailed it. We'll get into that. But one thing that you said is that he wants to control the narrative for everything. And then he actually got up with a request from his defense attorneys to narrate. I thought that was an interesting word that, here we are. You said that in your analysis. So
yeah,
that he likes to narrate, and here we are.
I'm just looking at my notes here, and right, I talked about this notion of control in our last show and how important that is to him. And I think so. Let's start with some of the nonverbals. There's this almost desperation with him, and I mean, you see it. He's anxious. You can see it, like he keeps furrowing his brow and his forehead. Like you see the anxiety he's displaying is palpable. That's for sure. But what's driving it? And what I wrote down in my notes is I put down desperation, and I underline it because I think there's this. When you talk about control, there's this desperation. He keeps looking at the jury, and it's almost like he's trying to befriend the jury. He's like having a conversation with the jury. And how close was the jury, by the way, to the witness stand? They looked fairly close.
Yeah, they were close. It's a small courtroom. It was small, and he was in the center of the courtroom, and they were to the side in the jury box. It wasn't it wasn't incredibly close. He was kind of away from his mic, and sometimes I wondered, can they hear everything? But it was a lot closer than, let's say, Chad Daybell's trial. So he turned to them, and medium close. I don't know, like vente close, I guess you could say.
Yeah, but you can sense with him that he's so desperate to get their attention and to convince them of his narrative. He wavers between like this desperation, like it's almost like he wants to just like shake them and say, "Can't you see this?" Right? So you've got this desperation, but then you have this other side of him, which is he's trying to be humble and he's trying to be respectful, but you can tell it's hard for him to do that. He has to really restrain himself to kind of present this humble side of himself. And in fact, there's a moment there, I think it was at the end of his first day of testimony, or maybe it was at the beginning of the second day, where I think it was at the end of testimony at the first day, where he stands up at the end and he starts talking to the judge, like he's the attorney. And in that moment, by the way, that's when the mask comes off. There's no humility there. He's acting like the defense, and he's acting like he owns the courtroom. He's directing traffic in the courtroom. He's telling the judge what to do, right? So this whole facade of humility and respectfulness it might be partly true, but he's really holding himself back. He's really restraining himself. And the reason I say this is because in those moments when he's standing up acting like an attorney, you see that other side of him that's really desperate for control and really kind of trying. He's the conductor in that courtroom, and that's what he wants to do. And he's trying. The desperation, I think, is really the desperation of getting that jury to believe him. And he knows that he can't, in the end, he can't go back there and deliberate with the jury. So you can just feel him trying to reach them and convince them. And by the way, that I talked a little bit about last time about how I thought he had some narcissistic features. We'll talk about that more tonight.
Yes, you did.
But
Ding, ding,
there's
ding.
this, yeah, ding, ding, right, yeah, um, yeah,
You're smiling.
there's this sense in which I want to touch on that just quickly here when I'm talking about how he's so desperate to convince the jury. You really have this sense in which he believes he can do that. You know, one of the extraordinary things here is when you look at this evidence is self-explanatory. I could argue that in the first 30 minutes of the prosecution presenting their case, and by the way, I think Christopher Hamner and Pamela Weckerly have done a really excellent job. But so Pamela gave the opening statements for the prosecution, and in the first 30 minutes, she lays out a narrative that's almost indisputable. You know, it's again, like talk about like she has video evidence of this guy who walks like Tellis and right and has no alibi for that time frame. He drives Tellis's car. He wears a hat and has a bag and wears shoes that are found in Tellis's home. Right, like
under his couch, stuffed in his couch. Right.
Yeah, right. She lays all this out. So if you go back to the opening statements, she lays this out in like 30 minutes. It's like case closed.
Victim had his DNA under, not just
right
near him, but under his fingernails, you know.
So the evidence, this is one of those cases where the evidence is self-explanatory and I think really overpowering. And they have every kind of evidence, cell phone, video, DNA, right? And it all lines up. But you have this defendant testifying who really thinks, he believes deep down at some level, obviously, that he can convince the jury in spite of all this evidence. Like he really thinks that his case is going to be so compelling that the jury, in spite of all that evidence, the jury is going to side with him. And that's something you would definitely see from someone with some narcissistic features. They believe that they're so exceptional and so special that no matter what the evidence is, their persuasive powers can override all that evidence, and the jury will clearly see his perspective, and they'll clearly side with him, and that's what he thinks. And so you have this clash between reality, which is the evidence, and his perception of the world, which is this narcissistically distorted, grandiose, exceptional view of himself and his powers of persuasion.
There was one other moment where his mask came off, and it was near the time where you referred to him standing up, but I'll say the cameras missed this.
Okay.
This was a moment to just take the standing up, but times it by 10. So it happened after that moment where he stood up and started talking to the judge. And then he stood up one other time, you know, to talk, and then he sat back down. And there was a moment where they were talking and he got really upset that his defense attorney was talking to the judge that same 10 minutes there. And the camera, unfortunately, this wasn't Law and Crime's fault, because their cameraman felt really bad that they'd missed it too. But he's like, they weren't choosing the angles. It was on automated. But as they were off of him, he jumped up. I'd never seen him jump up so fast. And he was going like this, just shaking his head as he jumped up, like, no. And I was like, oh my gosh. And he was so angry. And then it was like he caught himself and he never said anything. His defense attorney looked at him and then he just sat back down.
When did that happen? The jury obviously saw that.
The jury obviously saw it and everyone in the courtroom saw it, but you didn't see it at home. So he stood up. So it was the same time. It was about 5 minutes after the first time he stood, but he jumped up even like a rocket, like even faster. And as he was doing it, he was just shaking his head and going, no. And then it was like he kind of caught himself. His defense attorney, I don't think said anything to him. He just kind of looked at him calmly and then he sat back down.
Which, by the way, that this is one of those cases where I feel fairly confident the jury's going to come back quickly. I won't give you a number, but I think inside of an hour, the jury's going to come back, I would guess, with a guilty verdict pretty quickly. And my question is, so you have this clash between reality and this kind of distorted narcissistic perception that he has. I'm going to be really interested to see how he reacts. This clash between these two competing realities is so massive that I don't think he's going to take this in a very calm, measured manner. I mean, I don't see him. I don't know. I think it's going to be fascinating to see his response to a guilty verdict, if in fact that's what it is. Maybe all he has to do is convince one juror that his perceptions are accurate. But the problem is there's going to be 8, 9, 10 other jurors that are going to be like, look, here's the evidence.
I can see that single juror right now. Lean back. Well, you guys, he gave us a great lesson in probate law. And if you think about it, that realty company, it really does make sense that they might take his lookalike car, but switch a rim, go in there, take some of his DNA, put it under the fingernails, go back, take the shoes, chop them up, get into his house, put them under his couch, take the visor down in his car. I mean, what else do they need to do? My point, sorry, I'm being maybe too sarcastic, but I don't think there's going to be a single juror that buys this.
Right. I think the only one in the courtroom who buys it is himself. But again, that's a function of these potentially narcissistic features that he seems to display.
Yes. Go ahead.
But I think there's a moment here at the end when he's done testifying that I think really stood out for me. And I want to talk about that because I think that's a good way into this case. But it's not super self-evident what he's trying to do, but I think it really it goes a long way toward explaining what's happening here.
Okay.
So I want you to play that, and then we'll talk about, there's a lot of issues in here. One of the things from my perspective as a forensic psychologist is you've got potential issues around amnesia and dissociation and memory, right? Which is amnesia is a type of memory loss. Defense, denial, repression, there's personality disorder. You've got so many potential explanations here. I think it would be really important to kind of weigh those components and figure out what the most important elements are. And I'll try to explain that.
Perfect. And before we do that, then with that, let's hear a quick word from our sponsor for tonight, and we'll jump right in. We are getting ready for tonight's Hidden Hour. I am so excited because, of course, we're going to talk Robert Tellis's testimony, but I wanted to quickly share the good news. Our sponsor for tonight's show, Beam's Dream, my favorite natural sleep aid, the one that I say has changed our family's lives for the better, that I use every night now. They are giving us early access to their Labor Day sale. This actually truly does not start until next week. And they said, hey, Lauren, by the way, you can let people know. And I said, look, we go live on Saturday nights. Could you please give us early access? So they have done that. Use code TRUECRIME for up to 40% off all of their products. It's for a limited time to celebrate Labor Day. So True Crime, just make sure you know that. It's not hidden true crime. The code is True Crime, good old fashioned, two-worded, true crime. They were like, hidden true crime's too long, Lauren. We're doing true crime for your code. So that is starting for our hidden gems tonight, early access. You can get all of the products there. It has magnesium, it has amino acids, it is sugar-free, it is vegan, it is gluten-free. This is a drink that I get to make each night before bed while the family winds down, as our son does his homework. John does the dishes, I'll admit it, he does the dishes. And I get to sit on the couch and hang out and sip my dream. That the truth is out. That's how we do nights. Thank you, Dr. John. I make a little cup of it. I put hot water in it, and I sip it just like an herbal tea. I used to do chamomile tea. Now I do my dream. Now, I also mentioned, by the way, I've got to show you these. It's because of the heat. It has been so hot here. I'm back. The only reason I'm sitting back outside again is because it's now back down in the 90s after an entire summer of like almost 115 degrees every day. So now like it's feeling all balmy outside right now. So when it was so hot and I didn't want that hot drink, I was doing these capsules. So sometimes, you know, you're not at home or I'm traveling. I'm going to be traveling this week, by the way. I'm going out of town tomorrow. We'll tell you more about it tonight. But when, you know, I can't pack anything but like a carry-on, I take my Dream Beam capsules right there. I don't know why it's still blurry, but those have been a lifesaver this summer or when I'm traveling and just need to grab something. So grateful that they have been willing to partner with us and be a sponsor, because we love a company that we believe in, and we hope that you might too. So if you've been thinking about Dream, here's your opportunity. Labor Day sale, up to 40% off with code True Crime. You can also use the QR code, which I'm putting right here. Just shine your phone's camera on that QR code, or you can go to the description in this video and hit the link for 40% off code True Crime for a limited time. Thank you to Dream for giving our gems a early access to the sale, and we'll let you know where I'm going soon. I'll be taking these with us, and probably the chai too. I'm loving the chai. All right, we'll see you guys. Back to the show.
Okay. Is my mic on? Did you? Okay.
Back to the show.
All
Yes,
right, here
your
we
mic
go.
is on.
So,
And we've got Defense Diary with us tonight too. It's good to see you.
so let's play. I want to start with a clip. Not the kind of person.
Okay, not the kind of person. We have some clips. All right, ready to play it?
Yep.
Video camera that was right across the way from Mr. Gurman's house. You know, I do not engage in crime, but if I wanted to do something while not being caught on camera, and I knew there was a camera right across the way, I wouldn't do it. And which also brings up another point. If I knew there was a camera right across the way, I certainly would find another means of transportation besides using my own vehicle. You know, certainly, you know, I wasn't rich, but I certainly, you know, I did okay enough that I could rent a nondescript car, you know, but I couldn't see myself as the kind of person who would be foolish enough to use my own vehicle to allegedly commit any kind of crime. I would never engage in any criminal conduct because I respect the law. And I was trying to uphold the law in my position. And certainly I would not commit a murder because I have respect for human life. I don't believe that anybody should have their life cut short at the hands of another person. I am not crazy. I am not trying to avoid responsibility. This entire situation, well, I'll put it this way. I am innocent. And, you know, I'm not the kind of person who could brutally murder another man, do it with apparent experience and training, and then go to the gym and then go pick up my children. I can't imagine being that type of person. I didn't kill Mr. Gurman, and I'm innocent. Sir?
Okay. So
So
he's not crazy, and he
He's
wouldn't
not
commit that
crazy.
crime.
he's not crazy, and clearly, if he knew there was a doorbell camera across the street, he wouldn't have done this, right? But the thing I want people to pay attention to in that clip, and that was the very last part of his testimony, is he says at least 3 times, "I'm not the kind of person who would do something like this." Right? That, to me, that's fascinating, because it really, I think I'm going to get back to this because I have to build up towards it, but it really explains what's going on here. Just as a start, I would say there's an utter lack of self-awareness, in the sense that when you think about the kind of person he is, so let's use his logic for a second. When you think about the kind of person he is, this is someone who's lied to the court and to his defense attorneys. This is someone who potentially has perjured himself. This is someone who, on the stand the other day, admitted to having an affair at work.
Mhm.
This is someone who, under oath, acknowledged that there was a moment in 2019 when he was open to taking bribes.
Uh-huh.
This is someone who was arrested for domestic violence for choking his wife.
Yeah, that happened.
Right. So, so if you look at all these, potential, I don't know what moral indiscretions, I don't know what and he's saying he's not the kind of person that would murder, but he's not saying, so what kind of person is he? What he's not saying is, but I am the kind of person that would have an affair, that would lie under oath, that would commit perjury, that would choke my wife, right? Like, what? So what kind of person is he, right? Like, he's not helping himself by he's saying he's not the kind of person that would murder someone when he's. They didn't bring in the domestic violence part, by the way. The defense, I think, was able to keep that out because it was dismissed. But everything else they brought in the affair, right? They showed that he lied clearly. His defense would not direct him because they were worried about perjury. I'm sure they were worried about keeping their licenses.
Well, I noticed these multiple, and we put them all together, these multiple moments too. I'm not the type of person that would do this. I'm not a person. I don't believe someone should have their life cut short. But there's never, there were a couple, but not as many as this. I didn't do it. To me, that's like a big difference. And I want to ask you about that. Like, I would have thought there'd be more of like, I did not do this. I did not do this. But what he focused on was, I'm not the type of person that would do something like this. It was a weird thing to
Right.
emphasize.
Right. It's really that moment, and him saying that is really the key to understanding Robert Tellis. And we'll get there. I'll explain. I want to kind of build up to it, but I'll explain why that's so important. A normal defendant, or I shouldn't say normal, I'm not sure there's such thing as a normal defendant in a case like this, but let's say that a defendant who is genuinely innocent and believes in their innocence is not going to refer to themselves that way. They're going to proclaim their innocence from the rooftops, and they're going to say, I didn't do it. Here's why, right? Like, but he's not doing that. He's saying, I'm not the kind of person. And just a little teaser. So part of the reason he's doing that is because he's trying to convince himself that he didn't do it. But before we do that, before we get to that explanation, let's try to answer with his words. Let's try to answer what kind of person he is. I just mentioned some of the issues, the line and the domestic violence. And by the way, if you choke your spouse or partner or whoever, and your spouse calls the police about that incident, it's a pretty good bet that that's not the first time it's happened. That typically, if you're engaged in that type of violence, it takes a few of those episodes to get to the point where somebody calls the police. But they did call the police, especially in a situation like this, where Tellis is as he points out to the police officer, she says, "You're arresting me because I'm a public administrator. You're out to get me," right? Like, he thinks he's really important.
Yeah, his wife might have something to lose if she calls the police. She's married to him. This is the father of her children, and he is making the money, and he's a public official. I doubt she wants to call the police. And she
Right,
did it because
exactly.
she felt she had no other choice. Yeah.
But my point is, it makes you wonder what's going on in that home behind closed doors. It makes you wonder what the history of violence or domestic violence is in that home. And so, right. And so if we're trying to answer this question, he wants us to ask, he's telling us he's not the kind of person that would murder, but what kind of person is he?
Yeah.
So let's backtrack a little and try to figure that out. So if you could play the clip about the analytical mind.
All right, here we go.
And the only reason I say it is, like going along is like I've kind of developed this analytical mind, right? And so that led to me becoming an attorney. And so then that even built more on that analytical mind, where I think about, all the things, like all the things wrong in this case. And you add on top of that, the fact that I've been sitting in a cell for close to 2 years. So I've had a lot of time to think about a lot of these issues. So again, I think I'm going to point out some strange things about this case.
Can I also just say really quickly, he admitted just there, that's what I've always been saying. He had 2 years to think about what he was gonna say. And this is what he comes up with? But sorry to digress. What type of person is he?
Well, okay. So yeah, you're right. Like, I mean, let's point out another contradiction that he's had 2 years to think about this case. I presume he has access to legal pads and pens, and well, maybe not pens, but because he was suicidal, but he has access probably to some instruments where he can write. And he's had 2 years to like map out the case, his defense, to organize it.
He went to law school,
Yeah,
trial lawyer or not.
He's an attorney. He's had 2 years, and yet he gives us, when he's on the stand, he gives us this really haphazard, disorganized, chaotic presentation. Like, okay, so I mean, what does that say about it? You could chalk that up to anxiety. You could chalk that up to stress. But I mean, you'd think after 2 years of mapping out his defense that he would pretty much have it down. Right? But I mean, so that's another element here that's interesting to me, is that this is a guy who he says, so he tells us here that he's very analytical.
Right. An analytical mind.
But when you look at his defense, it turns out if he's analytical, he's not very organized. I think what he's saying when he says he's analytical is he's unemotional. And the reason I come to that conclusion is because if you look at him throughout most of this trial, I mean, he's anxious. He's extraordinarily anxious throughout this whole thing. But because I think the anxiety, is about persuading the jury more so than anything else. But when they show him the crime scene, when they present him with evidence that's indisputable, he doesn't show any emotion.
I know.
he's completely, the prosecutor confronts him on the crime scene and says, this is pretty bad, don't you think? He's like, yeah, it's gruesome, but I've seen worse, right? Like there's no really emotional response for somebody supposedly who, according to him, who just saw the crime scene photos for the first time at trial when the medical examiner presented them. He didn't have much emotion at all. And so he's telling us, he says, I'm really analytical, which means I really don't have a lot of emotion. But let's go to this next moment.
Which is?
The next moment is the search, the vehicle's search.
Here we go.
I had conveyed concern all along about my family. And as time went on during this detention, interrogation, whatever, I learned of various things that I believe would tend to, and did for me, break someone's spirit. I was informed that all of my vehicles were being taken away. And this was early in this interrogation. This was before they supposedly found a shoe, that they were taking all my vehicles away, which made no sense to me. And, it was a lot. Then all that finished. They were finished with the search. Then I walked into the house, and what I saw hit me even harder. I'd like to share the photos of my house after Metro finished their search. I think it's A2 to maybe S2. I would, if you wouldn't mind, could you take maybe 10 seconds of photo and flip them for me? So this is what I walked into in my house starting.
This is A2, A1.
All right. Okay, I know the similar looking photo?
Yes.
Okay.
Are you done with this photo?
Yes, sir.
All right. This is B2.
Coincidentally, I was led to believe that they were not going to make a mess of my house.
This is C2. This is D2. This is E2. This is F2. This is G2. This is H2. This is I2. And this is J2.
Sitting on the floor in our bedroom in the middle of this mess. And so this for me was, the thing that just broke me. I I'm sorry. I knew I didn't do this thing, and yet the police claim to have this evidence. They did what they did to me, and I have $1 million life insurance policy. I didn't want my family to have to go through more torture, and so I don't know what I was thinking, but I thought, you know what, if I can avoid the pain that they're going to suffer during this whole circus, some money into their hands to make up for me not being there, then maybe this is the thing to do.
Okay, we're good. So,
And just so you know, what you couldn't see while he was crying, while these were being shown, I actually didn't know you couldn't see everything. He had his hands. He had his face fully in his hands, just weeping. Actually, I didn't know that people couldn't see that at home. It was.
yeah,
It
we could
was
hear
like
it.
it was like Alec Murdoch without the snot. Like it was just full on crying.
Yeah,
Anyway.
and so I want to keep coming back to this question about, he raised it. He's not the kind of person that would commit a murder. But so what kind of a person is he? So he's analytical. He told us that. He showed no emotion whatsoever when they showed brutal pictures of the crime scene and someone that he allegedly murdered. But they go in, and our Gems got this right. Thank you guys for your comments. Those were amazing. You guys are right. You guys are completely accurate. One person said, "Dude, seriously?" ? Exactly. But let's talk about why he's doing this. So they go in to search his house. They upend his home, right? They toss his home a little bit. It's a mess. And I'm going to quote him. This was the thing that just broke me. Not the fact that he's being accused of murdering a beloved member of the Las Vegas community, but the fact that they went in and they made a mess of his home. Now, last week in our show, I speculated that I thought there were some features of OCD because he went back to the crime scene. He wanted to make sure, number one, that Jeff Gehrman was deceased, but he also wanted to see if he left any evidence behind. So he committed a major blunder by going back to the crime scene. And I speculated that the reason he did that was probably because he had some features of OCD. That he was obsessing. He was obsessing about the crime scene. He couldn't let it go. So he goes back. And as Christopher Hamner pointed out, that's typically not the behavior of a professional assassin. Which he was trying to argue this is a professional hit, and a professional assassin doesn't go back to check. But putting that aside,
well, professional assassin or a realty company, either or. But yeah, go ahead.
Give or take, aren't they? They're one and the same. Everybody knows that Compass Realty is loaded up with a staff of assassins in case they have to, in case they're accused of fraud. So, right. But here, so I said that last week, and here we're seeing that again. Those features of OCD are rearing their ugly head, and you see, this is a guy who's getting emotional, and this is the thing that breaks him, is the fact that his house is a mess. Never mind the fact that a human being was brutally murdered. That doesn't matter, but oh my gosh, his house is a mess. Can you believe it? He says, I don't want my family to go through this kind of torture because, God forbid, their clothes are on the floor, right? The important point here is this is giving us a picture of this guy that we're seeing. We're seeing the rigidity. We talked about this a little last week, but you're seeing this absolute rigidity and inability to adapt to the situation, and an inability to integrate this information about what happened and what he did. And this, so he can't, he can't come to terms with the fact that maybe what he did was egregious and horrible and had an impact on other people and the community. But he can come to terms with the fact that his house is now a mess, and he can't stand the fact that his house is a mess, because that more than anything upends his world. And I mean, not only are the priorities skewed here, but like, this is how this guy sees the world. And what the important part about this, putting aside the OCD, I don't know if this guy, he certainly seems to have some features of obsessive compulsive disorder. Again, somebody wrote us this past week and said, I need a shirt that says I'm not diagnosing, because I always say I can't diagnose because I haven't met him and done any testing. So I'm not diagnosing. I should wear my shirt. But the important point here, I think, is that this type of behavior and this crying over the fact that his house is a mess and that this is the thing that broke him, it starts moving us in the direction of personality disorders. And the reason that's true is because I'm going to read just briefly, I'm going to read the description of a personality disorder from the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. The current version of that there's a version 5, there's a revision. It's defined as an enduring, rigid pattern of inner experience and outward behavior that impairs the sense of self, emotional experiences, goals, capacity for empathy, and the capacity for intimacy. And there's always been this debate in the forensic and psychological community about whether personality disorders can change. There's always been this debate about whether personality disorders are treatable. And it's believed that some are and many aren't. I mean, there's no consensus on it. I think the current consensus is that there are certain treatments for certain kinds of personality disorders, like DBT for borderline personality disorders, that seem to be effective. But I don't think this debate is totally settled. Anyway, what's important about a personality disorder is that they're often resistant to change. And so you have kind of this rigidity and this pattern of behavior that's just really hard to change. And you're seeing that here. You're seeing it's not just, there might be some qualities of OCD, but more than that, I think you're looking at, and I speculated last week, there's some features of narcissism. I want to read just quickly. I want to read quickly from, now that I'm talking about personality disorders, I want to read from an article called Controversies in Narcissism. It's by Joshua Miller et al. This is from 2017. It's the annual review of clinical psychology. They kind of do an assessment of narcissistic personality disorder, but one of the things they say at the end, this is on page 303, is that in summary, narcissistic personality disorder is most strongly linked with an antagonistic interpersonal approach. And then they have in parentheses an antagonistic interpersonal approach, including grandiosity, entitlement, callousness, manipulativeness, non-compliance. And narcissistic personality disorder generally relates most strongly with disorders that share those traits. They go on to say that the personality disorders that share those traits are psychopathy, antisocial personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and paranoid personality disorder. So in other words, without the ability to diagnose, we know from the research that those people who show narcissistic features or have narcissistic personality disorder, they often have features associated with psychopaths, antisocial personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and paranoid personality disorder. So I don't know which one it is, but the important point I want to make here is that when they go in and search his home and he starts crying, and he doesn't have a shred of empathy or emotion for the victim, a victim supposedly he doesn't know, except for the articles, that he's not a friend with them. He's never been to his house. He's never seen the crime scene. If that's true, you would almost certainly expect some emotion, some empathy, right? Some caring, some concern. Unless you happen to have a personality disorder. And so, again, I don't know. It could be any of the ones I just mentioned. Somebody wrote and said, is he a psychopath? Well, here's the answer. I don't know if he's a psychopath, but psychopaths have a lot in common with narcissists, who have a lot in common with people with histrionic personality disorder. So I'm not exactly sure where he would fit in terms of that, but it's important it's important because somebody with a personality disorder would more than likely react to a home being searched in this manner, in the sense that they feel violated, right? They feel like their perfect world has been upended in some way. There's a rigidity here of somebody coming into their home and kind of taking it over and making a mess of it. There's this inability to see that as a necessary component of what would occur if you're accused of murder. Right? So having said that, this is going to bring me a little closer to an explanation of what's going on. And I want to talk about there's a research psychologist. His name is William Swan, and he has this theory called self-verification theory. And self-verification theory essentially states, well, actually, I'll turn to Swan himself. Swan can explain his theory better than me, but these are the elements of self-verification theory. This is from Swan. This is a chapter in a book called Self-Verification. This is on the first page. Swan says, once patterns of living have been established and maintained for some time, people summarize them by developing stable self-views. So you have experiences, those experiences get codified into stable self-views. Second, these stable self-views provide people with a powerful sense of coherence. So the second step is you have experiences, you develop self-views, those self-views become reinforcing, that you want to have a coherent sense of yourself. You want to be seen as someone who's consistent. You want those self-views to make sense to yourself. And thirdly, these feelings of coherence are so alluring that people will fight to maintain the self-views that produce them, even if it means enduring pain and discomfort. So the final piece of his theory is that when something happens that's uncomfortable, we will fight to maintain our self-views almost at any cost, even if it means murdering someone.
Wow. At any cost, including murder.
Well, they don't
Cost.
say Swan doesn't talk about that. That's my
that's your
two
addition.
cents. That's
Swan
my
says
addition.
at any cost, and the addition is at any cost, including murder.
I want to read a little more Swan to talk about how important this idea of self-verification or self-views is to this analysis. Swan goes on, this is on page 406. People's self-views represent the lens through which they perceive reality, lending meaning to all experience. Should people's self-views flounder, they will no longer have a secure basis for understanding and responding to the world, because they will have been stripped of their fundamental means of knowing the world. So now now we're getting closer to understanding what's going on here. Remember, Tejas is telling us that he's not the kind of person who would do something, right? He tells us multiple times, I'm not the kind of person that would do that.
He repeated it over and over and
Right.
over again. I wouldn't do something like this.
So what he's telling us, when he says that, what he's telling us is that his view of himself, his self-view, his perception is not consistent with someone who would commit murder. Right? He can't self-verify. He can't have a coherent view of the world if he has to integrate this information that maybe he committed a murder. So what happens is if you commit a heinous act and you have a view of yourself as a good person, that creates cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is this sense of anxiety when our view of the world and reality clash. And one of the ways that people typically, so there's a couple ways you can resolve cognitive dissonance. So you have this dissonance here with his self-views. You can resolve cognitive dissonance by taking that information and trying to integrate it into your sense of self, into your self-view. Or you can deny that information and create a self-view that's consistent with what you already believe about yourself. So if you think about Tejas, you have two situations here where there's, so when it comes to self-views, it always becomes an issue to some degree when someone's self-view is under threat, particularly if the person in question happens to be, say, a narcissist or have a personality disorder, because threat undermines their very sense of reality and it undermines their sense of security in the world. And with Tejas, you have two major threats. One of them's obvious, one is not so obvious. One is something the prosecution has tried to point out repeatedly in the trial. The first threat is you have Gehrman writing these articles, which, as the prosecutor, which Tejas agreed were character assassination. In his view, they were character assassination pieces. They were hit pieces. And the prosecutor got Tejas to acknowledge, yes, these attacked me personally. He acknowledged he was embarrassed by it, right? So that's the first threat.
Okay.
The second threat, which is less obvious, is the threat of the murder itself. And that's when he starts talking about, I'm not the kind of person that would do this. In other words, if you go commit a murder, I know this sounds crazy even saying this. If you go commit a murder and that's not consistent with your self-view, if it creates some amount of dissonance, then you're going to have to figure out a way to get past that, right? And I think what's going on here is Tejas is saying something. I'm trying to imagine Teles's like internal dialogue. He's saying something like, I may have just committed this murder, or this murder just happened, but because I'm not that type of person, I couldn't have done it. Right? His dialogue is an attempt to persuade himself, to convince himself, to stay coherent with the picture he has of himself as this brilliant, special, exceptional public administrator that's in the public administration office fighting evil. He's fighting the evil Compass Realty Corporation that's trying to harm the little guy and take all our money, right? Like, he's creating this narrative about, in a way, that he's kind of this hero, which, by the way, is why he also comes out as a victim, why he kind of adopts that victim role. So what's going on is that you've got this dissonance of these self-views, and the only narrative he can really tell himself, I think, he could say, I did it. Right. One way
Okay.
of resolving the dissonance is to say, you know what, I did it. I screwed up. I don't know why I did it. It was a moment of rage, whatever.
I didn't know I was capable of doing that.
Right. And then it's game over, right? He goes to prison for the rest of his life, but that's what might occur with someone who's healthy. And by the way, I'm not saying that this person's healthy, but that's what Chris Watts did, for example. Chris Watts confessed. I'm not saying Chris Watts is healthy, by the way. He's a horrendous murderer. But what I'm saying is that he's
he did that. He admitted to it. Is your point? And like even Chris Watts did that.
Even Chris Watts had the capacity, for whatever reasons, to acknowledge that he committed those crimes, and of course it was game over. But here presumably you have someone with a personality disorder who commits this crime, but he has to figure out a way he can live with it. And so this is why you get I'm not the type of person. Because on the one hand, at some level, he probably knows he did it. But on the other hand, he's going to convince himself that he's not the type of person that would do that. So I guess I didn't do it. So you have this kind of internal persuasion, this internal monologue going on, which is essentially, in psychological terms, denial. In the most simplistic terms, that's what this is. I think this is a personality disorder with a huge amount of denial. And by the way, so if you come to that view that you're not the type of person that could do this, and then you convince yourself of that. So if you're not the type of person that could do it, and then you say, well, I'm not that type of person, so I couldn't have done it, then the question becomes, who did it? Right? And that's where he pivots to conspiracy theories. That's where he pivots to, well, the police did it, and Compass Realty did it, and Rita Reed did it. Like, he has no other possible explanation.
But even that is wild to me, because he could say that so simply. He could say, I didn't do this, but let's find out who did. He could just spend his entire testimony saying, I didn't do this. Let me explain why I didn't do this. He doesn't have to spend his entire testimony saying, and I'm going to tell you who did do it. I don't know. That's weird to me too. Like, again, I agree with the commenters that are saying, if this was me, I'd be like, I didn't do it. But someone was murdered. Like, let's find out who did it. And he doesn't. I mean, he just is like, I'm going to tell you who did it. I don't know. It's weird. It's wild to me. Sorry. Keep going.
This monologue, I think, that he's having about, I'm not the type of person. Like, the only way you would say that to yourself is if you were trying to convince yourself of something, right? So at bottom, this is denial. This is a defense mechanism, but that's what conspiracy theories are too.
Ding. Okay. Boom. You just said that. This is also what conspiracy theories are. Convincing.
Conspiracy theories. I mean, okay. Let me.
Hey, I liked it. I keep going.
There's some conspiracy theories that have some, some support, I guess, some evidence. I mean, most don't, but I'm willing to acknowledge that some of them aren't necessarily defense mechanisms. But for the most part, that's what they do. Conspiracy theories are trying to present a version of reality that's not accurate. They're trying to shield us from fear. They're trying to shield us from uncertainty. They're trying to make the world more understandable and simpler and right. And so they're a defense mechanism in the sense that they're really shielding us from the complexity of the world or the reality that's really in front of us. And so here that's why you get this, because if you're going to say that you're framed, or if you're going to say that you didn't do it, if you're not the type of person that did it, then you're going to have to convince yourself that that's true. But you're also going to have to do something else. You're going to have to figure out who did it. And that's exactly what he did. So instead of presenting some plausible explanation of who did it, he's resorting to this really fantastic, surreal explanation, this magical explanation that involves this vast conspiracy, like all of Metro's in on it, Compass Realty's in on, like the prosecutor, Christopher was just like, okay, like how many people are in on this thing? And he's like, oh, they all are. It's not real, but it's not real because it's a defense mechanism that's shielding him from the reality that he did it, or that he likely did it. I guess I can't say he did it until next week.
You'll be able to soon. I have a feeling, a gut feeling. You'll be able to pull that off next week. And I'm not saying I sometimes go the conspiracy theory route myself. So I just really appreciated you explaining why we do that. Sometimes I can get there. I mean, I can recognize, okay, I just jumped. I just made a jump with not enough evidence, but let's explore this conspiracy theory I have for a second. But that's why people do that.
Right. He's doing it out of fear and because it's the simplest explanation. So that too becomes a defense mechanism. The other part of this that's important to understand. So people, I don't know if our listeners are saying this, but I had to think this through too. But some people might be saying, okay, there's this dissonance. And he's trying to convince himself he's not the type of person that would do it. And somehow he's able to convince himself. But what about the trauma? What about the event itself? Right? What about the memory? And I think doesn't he have a memory of the murder if he did it? And the short answer to that's where this kind of starts moving in the direction of amnesia or of dissociation, in the sense that amnesia. So let's talk about amnesia just quickly. Amnesia is about memory, so it's about memory loss. So there's different types of amnesia. There's something called localized amnesia, which is when you have a complete blackout for certain events. So, for example, you have a combat veteran who goes to war. And let's say he's involved in an ambush and he or she is involved in an ambush. The soldier survives that and they wake up, they're still alive. They don't remember anything that went on. That's localized amnesia. There's another type of amnesia called selective amnesia, which is, let's say the soldier goes through that same process of the ambush. They wake up, they remember some of it. They don't remember other elements of it. But it's a trauma that it's so overwhelming and it's so dramatic and it's such life and death that they essentially repress that, or the brain doesn't want to deal with that trauma. So it will essentially override all of that information. And I think, it's psychologists, by the way, have a term for this. So the forensic psychologists that testify about amnesia sometimes refer to it as red out. That red refers to rage or anger, and out means that because of this rage, and because of the heightened emotion, that sometimes defendants like Tellis may not remember a rage killing. And this is that type of killing. Right? So you could argue, I guess, you could argue that maybe Tellis had a red out. Maybe he didn't really remember what he did. Maybe he was so enraged and so dissociated in the moment that he committed this crime, and it wasn't until he went to the gym or whatever, if he went to the gym, that he even started having any recollection of the events. But the problem with that explanation is that I'm pretty sure the defense or Tellis would have latched onto that pretty quickly. So the combat veteran who doesn't remember the ambush, they know they don't remember the ambush. They talk about it. They say they don't. There's been plenty of defendants in criminal psychology and forensic psychology that have resorted or tried to resort to the amnesia excuse or defense, and most of the time it fails miserably. So it's a really risky defense. But Tellis never came out of the blocks when he interviewed police. He never said, I don't remember. Like, I guess that could have been another possible explanation in terms of resolving the dissonance. But he ruled that out.
I know he could have said that. That could have been something he could have thought of doing. I don't remember. Right. But yeah, that's not what he did.
He didn't open that door because he basically said, I would never do this. I wasn't there. Right. But he could have said I was there and I don't know what happened. Or he could not that he was there. He could have just said, I may have been in that area. I blacked out. I had amnesia. Right. But he never said that. So in a peculiar way, like he precluded any explanation for amnesia as a possible defense. But there's something here about memory that's important, and that is that memory is malleable and memory is reconstructive. So a lot of people think of memory as something that involves like taking a picture. They think of it's like a camera. You take a picture, you store it in your brain. That's not how memory works. Memory is dependent upon context cues. It's dependent upon the brain chemistry. It's dependent upon a lot of things. But what happens is that we often rewrite history. And there's been a lot of research on this. Elizabeth Loftus is probably the main researcher in this area, but it's important to know this because somebody like Tellis, if they feel like they're not that type of person, if they tell themselves that enough and they reconstruct whatever that memory is he has enough, it's possible for him to create a false memory to such a degree that it's consistent with how he wants to be seen.
Okay.
So in other words, like a big part of memory is that memory is contingent upon our needs and our desires and our goals and memory fits into in other words, memory often fits in the context of what I talked about with self-views. That if our self-view is somehow skewed or distorted and we don't like it, we can reconstruct memory. We can even create false memories that are more consistent with how we want to be seen. And so I think you have a version of that here. I think there's definite denial. I think Tellis knows. At some level, Tellis obviously, I think Tellis knows that he committed this murder.
I do too. And that's what everybody seems to think here in chat right now, that he knows. And he planned it. And he planned it. It wasn't just passion because he did planning.
But when the police showed up, so right, correct. I think he felt like he was going to get away with it. He was shocked when the police showed up on September 7th, and they were with a search warrant, and now he's a suspect. Now he's got this huge dissonance about, wait a minute, I thought I was going to get away with this. I'm not the type of person that would ever do something like this. Right now, he's got to figure out a way emotionally try to resolve this problem, this impasse. I'm gonna talk about a study here just quickly. There's a study from this is a I'm laughing because it's a totally bonkers study, but this is from a psychologist, Henry Otgar, 2009. This is in the Journal of Applied Cognitive Psychology, volume 23. The title of this is called Abducted by a UFO. Prevalence information affects young children's false memories for an improbable. Prevalence information affects young children's false memories for an implausible event. What they did in this study was they took a group of 7 to 12-year-olds essentially, and they provided them with fictitious information, false descriptions of certain events. One of them was like alien abductions. And essentially what they were able to do was to get a lot of these kids, over 70% of the children to falsely believe that they were abducted by UFOs. And essentially, the way they did that was it's one of the it's one of the most bizarre studies I know of, but certainly and there's ethical issues here about, if somebody was doing this to our 7-year-old, I would not be happy.
I'd be pretty ticked off. That was my first
Right.
thought. I'm like, wow, they did this,
Yeah.
huh? Okay.
Right.
Planting these.
I don't know how the hell, an institutional review board approved this study, by the way. But yeah, if my kid came home and he's like, Mom, Dad, I was abducted by aliens, I'd be like, what experiment were you what experiment were you participating in? That's bizarre.
But we have the study, so here we are. Let's hear it.
We have the study, so let's run with it. I'm going to conclude their conclusion here. This is the first study that succeeded to implant false memories of UFO abductions. And the reason, and the way they did it, so they combined false descriptions of events with prevalence information. When I talk about, I don't want to get too much in this study because it'll be a distraction. But when I talk about brainwashing, essentially I say the formula for brainwashing is essentially providing false descriptions or false information, which they do in the study, with repetition. And it also helps, if you're going to brainwash someone, it helps to have them in a really tired, vulnerable, depleted state of mind so that they're more suggestible. But that's basically, in terms of creating false memories, that's basically what they did in this study, is that they provided false descriptions with prevalence information, and means information, in other words, supporting the idea that it was what was happening with alien abductions was not only plausible, but quite common. And so, if the reason I bring this up is because if you look at someone like Tellis, who's trying to convince himself that he's not the kind of person that would commit a murder, you could have this. He would go through a similar process, which would be he would tell himself a false description of events, which was the hitman did it, and he would do it repetitively over and over, and he could potentially, through that process, create false memories. He could potentially, or at the very least, distort those memories of the murder.
Okay.
And so that's not amnesia, by the way. That's not a loss of memory. That's a distorted memory. And so, but I think this is more, there might be some element of that, of kind of these false memories that he's created for himself. But I think more than that, I think it's about belief. And that, that's something you and I talk about all the time with Daybell and so many of the Matthew Coleman, some of the trials we talk about, the cases we talk about, that he doesn't want to believe that he did it. And that gets back to this self-verification idea, that this view he has of himself, this self-view, he wants to keep that coherent. And when you put that, I think when you layer that with a personality disorder, and these threats to himself and to his view of himself, I think that's how you land here.
Okay.
And that's how you get to the point where you can have someone on the stand saying, who clearly the evidence is so stacked against them, you can have someone on the stand testifying on their own behalf, and to some bizarre degree believing that they didn't do it, and believing that they're not the type of person capable of doing that, even though they did it. So I think it's this combination of belief, self-verification, and personality disorder that really kind of creates the cauldron for all of this to happen.
Thank you. A lot of people are asking questions about court as far as the jury goes. They were watching all of this with a very straight face. I referred to it as a poker face. You can take that for however you want. What I mean by that is I couldn't see any emotion whatsoever on their faces. They were hard to read, but I think that means they're not showing him any sympathy. They're not showing him any confusion. It was just pretty straightforward. Like, that's how the jury's reacting. So I just wanted to share that really quickly. Yeah, it was, and you're right. I was very, very close to him in this small courtroom. I did not feel in danger. He did not have shackles. Many people wondered that. I just knew that I wasn't a target. He didn't look behind. I don't think he would be looking at me for any reason. And of course, if I was going to like catcall him, maybe that would be something I should be worried about. But
Yeah, then you'd be in shackles.
right. But then, right, I'd also be in shackles. And then some other questions people had were, for you, John. We do need to run because of our child care. I wanted to bring this up, not Teus, not Tellus. This was, but
Yeah.
Tellies. But so here's a question for you. I'm going to pull something up here. You're talking about reality, and this is a question I have because throughout the entire trial, people were asking, how do you pronounce his name? Is it Teus or Tellus? And I just have to ask this because I think it's interesting. So first off, let me share this right here. This is Las Vegas Review-Journal. People in El Paso still use the Spanish pronunciation Teus for the family name. But during his time in Las Vegas, Robert Tellus pronounced his last name Tellus. This is Las Vegas Review-Journal. This is the paper that Gehrman worked for, who interviewed Tellus, who followed Tellus's story. They are stating that Robert Tellus pronounced his name Tellus, and that is true that he would pronounce it in person that way on his political commercials, campaign, and in the paper and in the media. So let me now, though, I want to show this because I need to understand what's going on here. And here you go.
Days, Robert Days. The first name is Robert. The last name is Telles. Robert Days.
So there, in court, he pronounced it Robert Teus.
Yeah, let's end. This is an amazing. Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up because this is completely consistent with our discussion tonight. Yeah, right. And not only did he, as you pointed out in the article, not only did he pronounce it Tellus, but everyone in the court, until he said that, his lawyers, the prosecution, everyone was pronouncing it Tellus.
And it was more than once that he said Teus. Roberta, his mistress on the stand, pronounced it Teus, and then later in court, he then again said Teus. Right.
Right. And so yeah, it's fascinating. You can't make this stuff up. It's so bizarre. But I think the short answer is it gets back to that question of why is he saying I'm not the kind of person that would do this. So there's almost, you have a version here. This is not, by the way, dissociative identity disorder, but let's call it a minor version of that. In the past, people would know that as multiple personality disorder, which is a dissociative disorder, which has to do with memory, by the way. just a quick overview about dissociative identity disorder or multiple personality disorder. Typically, that occurs when children are traumatized, and it creates a disruption in identity, where the child will typically create other identities in order to cope with persistent abuse. So the difference between dissociative identity disorder and amnesia, for example, is that amnesia tends to be at least localized amnesia. It tends to be a one-off event, whereas dissociative identity develops over time. It's developmental. It occurs over a fairly lengthy period of time. So this is not, let me clarify, with Telis or Teus, this is not that.
Okay.
However, I do think in the context of I'm not the type of person that would do this, I think you have let's call it a minor version of that, where I think he's trying to associate the murderer with Telis. And he's trying to say that he, Teus, is someone different. That Teus would never do that because he's not the type of person that would do that. And I mean, I don't think he's doing this consciously. I think this is definitely more unconscious or subconscious, in the sense that he's trying to create distance emotionally from that person that he thinks of as Telis. That maybe Telis committed that murder, but Teus, he didn't. And so it in a way, it's also related to this idea of, so multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder is about, in many ways, taking flight from anxiety and abuse by creating these other personalities that are able to cope with the trauma. So it's an anxiety reduction technique, and I think that's what this even though it's a very peculiar way of doing it, I think this difference between Telis and Teus is a very peculiar way for him to try to make a distinction from someone who could be a murderer and someone who is not.
Fascinating. Somebody else asked.
At the very least, it's a way for him to create distance from all the anxiety that's associated with Telis, with this person that everyone's calling Telis, that he knows to some degree, but now he's going to switch it up a little bit, and he's going to have people call him Teus, and he feels like that person, Teus, is a different person than the murderer.
Wow, fascinating. Thanks for sharing that. Many other people asking if I actually saw tears while he was crying. I want to just share that I did not ever see tears when he was crying. I can't tell you whether there were or weren't tears. He was just far enough away, but I did not see any. I want to also thank, Law and Crime, the incredible, talented photographers that were there doing pool video. They're here tonight in the chat. And so I just want to say hi. And you guys did a heck of a job capturing what you did. I also learned that they did capture him crying as well as some other things, but different networks shared different things. And then I also want to say, did you see Bob is here from Defense Diaries? I mentioned that. I don't think you heard me, John, say that, but we're working with Bob.
Yeah,
and,
I saw that earlier. Hey guys. Hey, Bob.
we'll be in touch with you this week. We are. I want you guys to know that the Defense Diaries is covering Delphi, and John and I'll just give you a little teaser. We are digging deep into that too, and Bob is helping us. And there's some incredible podcasters covering that case, and we are seeking their help as we gather information. A couple other things too. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, John.
Let me just comment on Delphi. Delphi is an absolutely it is a swamp with with endless degrees of endless levels of the abyss below the swamp. Like, it is
the investigation and the trials,
everything.
what you're referring to.
No,
Yeah.
yes, right. The evidence, the kill, who's the kill, like all of it.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
It's a swamp without bottom. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's absolutely horrible, and it's also one of those cases that's at least every parent's worst nightmare and every child's worst nightmare. You know, when we start talking about it, I'll talk about, I grew up in a rural community in Southern Illinois, not far from Delphi. And I spent a lot of my childhood running around on abandoned railroad tracks. And like, it has some personal resonance for me because it never would have occurred to me. And I did that alone, by the way. I didn't do that with a friend, but it never would have occurred to me that some person or group of people would have, you know, abducted me and murdered me at some point. I mean, that wasn't even on my radar, and nor should it be on a child's radar, by the way. So yeah.
Yes. And then a couple other announcements, and then I have one more question for you. We do need to run because our childcare needs to go. But I do want to share that we put up 3 podcast episodes today covering the Stephen Stearns case. We have all of the newly released police interviews between Jennifer Soto, Stephen Stearns, on our podcast that you can get on Apple or Spotify. So go over there, subscribe. We're going to be continuing to post some podcast episodes there that we don't even get on our YouTube channel, just to make sure we're covering all of the cases that we need to cover. And then another case we've been covering, Corey Richins. Don't forget that her preliminary hearing, it's going to be a wild 3 days because of the evidence they're going to produce. Corey Richins is going to, her preliminary hearing starts Monday, and that is where I'm going. I am going out of town, and I will be at Corey Richins' preliminary hearing, and we hope to live stream that here on Hidden True Crime. I wanted to share that. Last but not least, book club. I'll be doing it from Park City, Utah, but our book club is this Wednesday evening, and for those on our Patreon and our YouTube memberships, I will be posting a link to that soon. I'm trying to decide if I'm going to do it on StreamYard or Zoom. Look for that link, though. We're going to be talking about The Woman They Could Not Silence by Kate Moore, who I've also interviewed, the author. McSpunky, I saw your details about the spring Bellagio party. Let's get in touch because we also have to plan that. We have not forgotten. We got to get on that too. There's been a lot going on. Okay, John, one other thing. I just have to share this. This was a moment in the trial. I was debating how tall he was the entire time. I said he's shorter than me. I'm 5'6". And then we learned that his arrest record said he was 5'7", and I was super confused, going, wait, I swear he's shorter. Is he an optical illusion? This is how tall he says that he is in trial.
Difference. I don't know if you noticed the height difference. I wear lifts in my shoes. I'm about 6'5.5", and call it a vanity thing, right? I just wanted to feel a little taller. And so if I may just demonstrate why this is important. So these shoes that have built-in lifts.
So we learned a couple things. He says he's 6'5". I guess it was a Freudian and a half. I guess it was a Freudian slip. I suspect that he meant to say that he was 5'5.5". So there answers my question. And then we also learned that 5'7" from the arrest records is probably his lift. But I guess what I want to focus on here is the lift, and I mean, I color my hair. I mean, I don't know. I guess everyone's got their bits of vanity. He wears a shoe lift to look taller. The
most interesting thing about that clip is when he says, call it a vanity thing.
Yeah.
Right. He's essentially saying, I mean, I'm not diagnosing here, but he's essentially saying, I'm a narcissist. Right. He's calling himself vain. I mean, he's not quite saying that, but like, if you get up and say that in front of the entire world, like, why not just make the argument about the shoes? Why throw in the vanity part?
Right. He wears a lift. Boom.
Is he trying to be humble? Also, let's talk about his argument. Like, he couldn't have worn brand name shoes because he had to have lifts. Like, okay, so You couldn't have just gone out to commit the murders in brand name shoes without the lifts for one day? Like, what? So you have to have lifts in all of your shoes, even when you're committing a murder. That's the argument? Like, am I supposed to say,
He could never
oh
have worn
yeah,
those Nikes because he wears
yeah,
lift no matter what he's doing. Even in his combat training, he claims
he's
yeah.
gotta be over 5'5.5". He's gotta, right? If you, I guess, I mean, it's such a bad argument.
There's no possible way he did this because he would have been wearing his lifts. So
And
he would have not
who
looked short, Colin Vane, if that was him in that sun hat and orange outfit. Call him Vane, he would have been wearing lifts.
and what defendant takes the stand for a murder and calls themselves vain?
Right, and then he admits to owning the Nikes. I noticed that too. Right, calling them Vanes.
I mean,
That was a
hey
good moment
guys,
too.
hey guys, I'm vain, and you know, didn't do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anyway, John, do you wanna I just had to throw that out there too. Do you wanna
Yeah.
end this? I know that, we've gotta run. So,
Yeah,
unfortunately.
I'm gonna end with, it's been a while since I've read Shakespeare, so this is a passage I love from Shakespeare, by the way, that's completely relevant to Robert Tellis and a lot of criminal defendants, and our discussion tonight. This is from Macbeth. People that know me know that I love Macbeth. I'm obsessed with Macbeth. It's like the first book about a serial killer in Western literature. So I've been reading Macbeth since I was like 15 years old. Many times. This is from Act 5, Scene 3. This is Macbeth speaking to the doctor who is noticing that his wife, Lady Macbeth, is acting strangely. The doctor says, "Canst thou not minister to a mind diseased? Pluck from the memory a rooted sorrow, raise out the written troubles of the brain?" To which the doctor responds, "Therein the patient must minister to himself." So, in other words, a diseased mind, a memory that's rooted in sorrow, written troubles of the brain, it's really hard to get rid of those. You can try to repress those memories. You can resort to amnesia, right? You can dissociate. You can resort to any defense mechanism you can imagine. But in the end, ministering to a mind diseased is really difficult, and it's really difficult to hide. And if you're a defendant on the stand like Tellis, it's going to come out that you still have those memories and they're still affecting you, and that he's not past it. And I think, to me, that was obvious that there's really no simple way to try to present yourself as healthy and as someone who is part of this vast conspiracy in a way that's believable to not only a jury, but probably to the community at large.
Thank you. Dr. John, thank you so much. Thank you to our other fellow creators for being here as well. Attorney Melanie Little, Defense Diaries. We love this incredible community of those sharing their expertise and helping us understand the unthinkable and the unfathomable. Thank you to our incredible mods too, dropping links right and left. And of course, thank you to Dr. John. I actually can't thank you enough. I've been told I thank you too often, sweetheart. So,
Well, thank you for,
so
thank
I'm
you.
going to stop thanking you. No more thanks to
Well, I
you.
wanna
Just
thank
thank you to
you.
everyone else.
I want to thank you too. Thank you for your hard work. And yesterday, I mean, behind the scenes sometimes at our home is crazy. That yesterday was like, what, a 14-hour day. I mean,
Oh yeah, we did a 4-hour interview at our home yesterday too, guys. So there's also that. We'll just put a pin in that. You'll be seeing that soon too. It's going to be good. I'll just say.
for thank you for going to these trials. It seems like every courtroom you enter, it just becomes crazier and crazier. So, but I'm really grateful of your commitment to our work together and your insights, and for being such a wonderful spouse and mother to our son. And so I want to thank you back.
Well, thank you. You can't thank me back because I can't thank you anymore. But thank you.
Oh, and I need to get a shirt that says I'm not diagnosing, or at least I need to have like a sign behind me that says I'm not diagnosing.
Yeah, let's just get that in lights behind you. No diagnoses here. But I'll take one for the team during my lunch lives and couch diagnose anytime. So that'll do. All right. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. Let your friends know about us. And we appreciate so much. This was a great night. And may justice be served next week for Jeff Garman. We did a whole tribute to him last week. People are mentioning him, the victim in this case. He was, he did so much good in this world. And you know what? I just want to say this too. I believe that he knew and he got that DNA under his fingernails because he was in a long sleeve shirt and a hat, and he was his assassin was fully covered, and there was a struggle, and it was a heartbreaking. I want you to know I saw the crime scene in court. You guys didn't see that either. We saw him. We saw his stab wounds. We saw what happened to him, and we saw the struggle on camera, close up, or what we could see. It was across the street, but it was. I believe that Jeff Garman testified beyond the grave by doing that in his final moments and getting that DNA under his fingernails. He told his final story by doing that and fighting until the end. And so for those that want to get to know Jeff Garman and his work, head to our last week's Hidden Hour. We give him tribute there. So may we all be able to report and share and discuss without fearing for retribution. So may justice be served next week. All right.
Yeah.
We'll see you guys.
All right.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night.